Right. Okay. I think that looks like we've got everyone, the last few stragglers in the room. So let's make a start. So morning again, everyone, and hello and welcome to this Farscape webinar this morning. Today, as you can see, we're going to be talking about accessing Safe Brain in order to create resilient leaders and organisations. So my name's Neil Kimberley, and I'm the commercial director here at Farscape Development. And here at Farscape, we do have the privilege of working with some of the leading thinkers around a variety of new and current topics. And I think one of the most interesting and prominent at the moment is the field of neuroscience, and specifically how it can be applied practically in the business world. And I think the advances in neuroscience are really allowing us to more fully understand our emotional responses to different situations. And the new research has given us access to how the brain works in a way that hasn't really been possible in the past. And we can now see more easily how our basic human responses, directly impact on and are influenced by the cultures that exist in our workplaces, the way we lead, and how effective we are in our roles. And there are also some really interesting links between both neuroscience, how that leads into the development of neural pathways and neuroplasticity, and also emotional literacy, which is something that we've explored in more detail in a previous webinar. So we'll be highlighting these links as we go through the rest of the presentation. So for today, we're going to be pulling together some of the current thinking that exists in this particular space to explore how our developing understanding of the brain and how it works can help us to more readily access our safe brains, which in turn, then allows us to be both more creative, to be resilient as leaders and managers, and to then really start to build organizations that are genuinely fear-free. This isn't all our own work. We're going to be drawing on some of the work from Daniel Siegel, Christian Neff, Daniel Goleman, Alicia Wickramansinga, and we'll point you towards these interesting resources as we go through the presentation. So just before we get started, just a brief admin point. There's quite a few of you today, so rather than try and get involved in giving people audio access, which can always trip up the IT system, we'll just take questions through the chat function. So you'll see on your screen you've got the option there to pose questions. So as Ruth's presenting, I'll be keeping an eye on the questions, and if I think they're relevant at the point she's at or it hasn't been covered, I'll drop them in. Otherwise, what I'll do is I'll reserve all the questions till the end, and we'll try and sort of pull those together and capture them at the end if we haven't done so during the presentation. So moving straight into the presentation, I'd like to introduce you to Ruth Moody. So Ruth's our Managing Director here at Farscape, and she's got a particular passion for this subject and is going to lead you through some of this current thinking. So Ruth, before we actually get stuck into the presentation, what is it about this topic that's so important to you at the moment in your thinking around leadership and organisational development?
Hi Neil, thanks ever so much. I think for me, in terms of the work that we do, we so often go into organisations and work alongside people who are operating from a place of feeling threatened and feeling fearful about various things, and actually that has a significant impact on how effective they can be and also whether they feel happy at work. And so this topic is of particular interest to me because my belief is, and through the work that we've done with people as well, that actually if you can help to people to understand what's triggering their responses, what things are perhaps triggering their fear or their threat brain response, we can then help them to develop practices and ways of changing their responses so that they're more effective in their roles and hopefully happier at work. So that's why this is so important to me. So I think before we get stuck into this topic, from my point of view, I think it's really important to look at the current landscape. So why is it important to be able to access what we're calling safe brain, and what's the environment like that has created this need? And we're then going to go on to look at some of the background, so how the brain's evolved and why we respond in certain ways to different situations. Once I've set this context, we can then begin to explore some of the current thinking around this, and in particular, how the brain is able to develop new neural pathways through focus and attention. And then finally, we'll go on to explore some of the ways in which individuals can take responsibility for developing these new ways of thinking in order to access this safe brain state. Just first signpost of the webinar, for those of you who haven't read it, The Fear-Free Organisation is a really excellent book to read in order to help to understand some of the landscape that does exist in the current corporate or business culture. It's great, and what's really interesting for me is the way it opens. I think in perhaps one of the first sentences is this one that you can see on the screen here. So fear is one of the most powerful motivating forces in our working culture today. And what's a bit frightening is that an overwhelming majority of bosses use fear, whether deliberately or mindlessly. And I'm sure the majority of people in their working life have felt fear of some kind. So whether that's fear of being unfairly criticised, the fear of being fired, fear of being excluded, fear of not being good enough, fear of being considered lazy, lots and lots of different things trigger fear for people. And it very easily takes over excitement and enthusiasm as the primary driver of motivation. It's actually very easy to tap into someone's fear system. And what we're coming to understand more and more is that fear as a motivator is damaging to both people and companies. It comes at a huge cost to people's physical and emotional well-being. And I'm sure you've all seen examples of it every day. So stress, burnout, anxiety, absenteeism, illness. The impact of fear on an individual can certainly be profound. But it's not just the people it impacts on, it's also the organisations and the businesses. And what's interesting for us when we go into businesses to work with people, sometimes we hear the argument from leaders that fear acts as a great motivator because it drives people harder to succeed, to win, to overcome. And whilst the answer to that is, well, yes, in the short term, that may work, actually what we know is that in the long term, as we're going to go on to explore today in this webinar, it actually narrows people's ability to think clearly and to be creative and to take risks. And ultimately, it starts costing companies, both in terms of time and money, to deal with the damage to employees. And it also creates companies that survive rather than thrive, because people who are motivated by fear actually aren't that efficient. So they're not able to be innovative and creative, because to do that requires taking risks and accepting the possibility of making mistakes and failing, which isn't possible in a culture that's driven by fear. So whilst fear is essential to our survival, persistent fear can start to destroy people. And what I'd like to do now is to take a look back at the development of the brain and our basic human responses to understand how this works and why it's important, really to give some context then around why it's important for people to be able to access what we're calling safe brain and the benefits that that can have. So going back then to look at the evolution of the brain, many of you may have seen this diagram or something similar, but essentially in the early 1950s, neurologists proposed the model of what's called the triune brain to explain the evolution of the brain from the reptilian function to the human function. So the oldest part of the brain that you can see indicated here in red is the reptilian brain, and that controls the instinctual survival behaviours, so the autonomic functions, breathing, pulse, blood pressure, balance, all of those sorts of things. The next part of the brain that then developed was the limbic brain. So that really evolved to control responses to basic emotions, so feeding, drinking, fighting, fleeing, etc. And this limbic part of the brain includes the hypothalamus, which is responsible for the production of hormones that govern and regulate emotions, and also the amygdala, which are a group of neurons that play a key role in processing emotions. And then finally, the last part of the brain that developed is the cerebral cortex that you can see there in green. So that evolved most recently and controls the higher order processes, so things like thinking, reasoning, language, problem solving, etc. I think it's useful, and I've heard people who we work with closely refer to it in this way, to think of the development of the brain in computer terms. So each layer has developed on top of the last, a bit like a staged upgrade rather than a wipe and reboot. And so that means that our survival brain still responds as it did millions of years ago, when the landscapes and threats were very different. And we're going to go on to explore now how this can cause problems. You'll see on the screen in front of you a picture of two brains, and what we're calling the old brain and the new brain. And just for simplicity, I'm going to refer to the reptilian and limbic functions as the old brain. So over there on the left, the parts of the brain that deal with emotions, so fear, anxiety, anger, joy, etc. And then on the right, So the neocortex, that's the new brain. So for simplicity, as I go through the presentation, I'm going to be referring to old brain and new brain, and what that refers to. But what's really interesting and what we've learned is that the interaction of our old and new brain capabilities can cause us problems. So we can get caught in loops where our old brain sends out really simple messages that our new brain then complicates. And I want to go on to now take a look at how that all works. So the tricky brain. Our brain can sometimes trick us or overthink and interpret things in unhelpful ways. And I wanted to take the example of a zebra. So a zebra is guided by the old brain, so it doesn't tend to get caught in these sort of tricky loops. So what happens when a zebra sees a lion? Well, it runs away, and then when it's safe again, it starts eating. If we were then to take a look at the human and what happens when a human sees a lion, well, hopefully we would also sensibly run away. But when it's safe again, it's likely to do a variety of things. So it's going to start imagining, what if I had been eaten? That would have been really painful. Predicting, I bet that lion's still there waiting for me. Integrating, well, there's been a drought, there's less food available, which means I'm more of a catch. Planning, I'm going to have to move, I'm going to have to live somewhere else. And ruminating, but I've never been a fast runner, I'm doomed, I'm bound to get caught. So this is a simple example of how an unhelpful loop develops. And what happens then is, as these thoughts form, they then go on to trigger our fear state further, which causes potentially more rumination and worry. So we're suddenly then stuck into this threat-based loop. Just as an aside, a really good book if you're interested in this is Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, and it explains how prolonged stress causes or intensifies a sort of range of physical and mental afflictions, so things like depression, ulcers, colitis, heart disease, and lots more. And it also is really good at offering some guidance to how we can start to control our stress responses. So a really good book to look into if that's an area that you'd like to know more about. But what does this actually mean in organisations? So if we just go back to where we started today's webinar, so fear is one of the most powerful motivating forces in our working culture today. When we experience fear, what's known as our threat brain is triggered. So I'd like to just go on to talk a little bit more about what our threat brain is. So on the screen in front of you, you can see a diagram which depicts 3 areas in the brain. And these are called sort of motivating systems, as defined by Dr. Nilisha Wickramasinghe, who Neil mentioned at the start of the presentation. Nilisha works very closely with us as part of the FastGate team and has led some really groundbreaking research in this area. And essentially what she's described is that there are these 3 basic motivating systems which are related to the evolution and growth of our brain capability. So our earliest emotions were designed to alert us to danger so that we could survive and ultimately we could go on to reproduce. So this is what we're calling our threat brain, which is the red area on the left of the screen. Then as we went on and evolved into mammals and realised that protecting our young increased our chances of survival, we developed emotions that motivated us to bond and care. So this is then the development of the safe brain over on the right-hand side in blue. And then later on, as we began to live in larger, more complex groups, our brain developed drive-based emotions, which were to motivate us to compete and to raise our status and to accumulate resources. So there are these 3 motivating systems that exist within our brain that we're going to go on to look at in a bit more detail now. And I'd like to start with the threat brain. So the function of this motivating system is to pick up on threats quickly and then send us bursts of feelings, so feeling like disgust or fear. And these feelings then alert us and urge us to take action against something. So if you remember that emotions motivate us, so those feelings will motivate us to take action against that threat. So for example, to protect ourselves. So the effect of this system is to then activate the behavioural fight, flight or freeze response that you may have heard of. And the most common emotions associated with this motivational centre are anger, anxiety and disgust. So as I mentioned earlier on, the amygdala are part of this limbic system, and they comprise a collection of fast-acting neurons that are designed to detect emotions as they occur in us and react quickly. So the amygdala detects all emotions, however they are particularly sensitive to threat-based emotions such as fear, which is why they're often referred to when we talk about fight, flight or freeze. So the threat response is a series of reactions that occur when we perceive or experience a threat. And threat refers to a range of triggers from real danger, so running from a burning building, to more subtle or imagined danger, such as criticism from our boss, which would then trigger that fear of rejection. And helping people to become more aware of the sort of more subtle threat triggers can be really useful in helping us to respond more mindfully when they appear. And you'll notice as we go through this presentation that the word mindful is going to come up a lot, and I'll touch upon that in a bit more detail later on. What's interesting, I think, to note is that if your brain struggles to determine whether something is a threat or not, if it's unsure, it will usually decide that it is rather than it isn't. That is, unless you've trained your brain to respond otherwise, and that's going to be part of what we go on to look at later. So when we experience threat, our sympathetic nervous system is activated and our body is flooded with strong chemicals such as noradrenaline and cortisol. And these chemicals and reactions are designed to help us either to run away, to fight, or to freeze. So they boost energy and help us to take action. And they can also help us to focus attention in order to respond quickly. However, this kind of stress response does tire the brain and body quickly because it uses up a lot of glucose and oxygen. And it can then have negative health effects if it occurs too frequently. So it increases sort of defensive or narrow thinking, and it affects our ability to process new information, and it certainly decreases memory capacity. Interestingly as well, these kind of powerful chemical reactions also instruct other parts of the brain. So the hippocampus, for example, where they're instructed to create a record of this emotional experience. So basically they're asking it to create a memory, which means that we become hypersensitive to the threat if it happens again. And then finally, the cortisol suppresses our immune system as well, which is sometimes when we relax, we get ill. So you can see that whilst the threat response has a really positive impact in the face of genuine danger, actually in today's modern world with the complexity of things that we're dealing with, we can find ourselves spending a lot of time in this threat response, which actually has a really detrimental effect on us both emotionally and physically. One of the things that we do, and one of the problems in a corporate setting, is that we often regulate threat by activating that drive-based center, so the drive-based emotions and motives. So we feel threatened, and rather than fight or freeze or run away, we decide that we want to compete and achieve and conquer and accumulate. And that's great because it means that we sometimes can deliver some fantastic results when we're really under pressure. But our drive brain releases dopamine, which is a potentially addictive chemical in our brain. It stimulates feelings of drive and excitement and a sort of hyped up sense of pleasure or urgency. It's got a similar chemical structure to drugs like cocaine and speed, or they sort of mimic the effect of dopamine. So whilst it is naturally stimulated, so when we win or when we fall in love or we're promoted, we get a hit of that dopamine. Too much of it over a prolonged period can be damaging. So this system, this drive-based center in our brain, is frequently overstimulated in the business world, which is a problem because, as I've said, if you then withdraw that stimulus, you can then create withdrawal behaviours, so boredom, restlessness, the inability to concentrate, anxiety. So the drive to want more is both useful and a problem, because from a very, very early age, we're taught to strive and to not be content. And it's also this kind of motivational centre is highly involved in the competitive and comparative social urges. So the drive brain can regulate threat and be really helpful. But if it's used without safe brain support, we simply get into an unhelpful but very common loop that we see, particularly in business. So, for example, if someone has a threat brain response to not achieving something or to being concerned that they're going to lose their job, their response to that is to work harder and to do better. And so they get stuck in that loop of, here's the threat, I'm going to work harder, I'm going to push myself harder. And eventually that will start to have a negative impact on the individual concerned. So if we look at that from a different perspective, in this diagram here on the screen, we experience threat, and the way we cope with that or overcome it is to move into drive. So you can see threat at the bottom left of the diagram, and then an arrow moving up towards drive to the top right-hand corner. So we move into drive, striving, working harder, working longer, all of the things that eventually lead to burnout and anxiety and stress. So it's no wonder that that sort of behaviour in the workplace is toxic. So on the bottom right there, you can see safe, and actually moving from safety into drive is a much healthier thing. So what about Safe Brain? What is different about it, and how does it allow people to move into the drive-based behaviours in a more positive way? Well, let's just spend a bit of time looking at what we mean by Safe Brain before we then go on to look at how people can start to access Safe Brain. So this motivating centre of the three, if you remember there was threat, drive and safe, this motivating centre helps to regulate both our threat and drive centres, and it's about soothing and contentment. So this centre emerged to support the job of warm-blooded mammals to look after and nurture their young. So caring evolved because of the genetic benefits it conveyed, because it helped offspring survive for longer and it increased their chances of reaching maturity and going on to reproduce. And if you contrast that with the diagram at the top of the screen there of turtles, as we all know, turtles lay hundreds of eggs and then leave their offspring to survive as best they can, and only 1 to 2% tend to make it. So that kind of early caring evolution was fairly basic. It was around feed and defend. We shouldn't underestimate that evolutionary leap, because it created a mind that was able to recognise and respond to distress calls from others. Animals also have the capacity and need for rest and satisfaction and contentment. So being able to do so stimulates reparative changes in the body. So when this Safe Brain centre is activated, you have natural chemicals called endorphins are released, and also the hormone oxytocin, which facilitates attachment and affiliation with others. So one of the great things about oxytocin, in fact many of the great things about oxytocin, it reduces blood pressure, it stimulates the immune system, it has an anti-anxiety effect, it stimulates positive social interactions, it reduces cortisol. So essentially it can suppress the activity of the amygdala. And then endorphins have a similar effect and are particularly helpful in soothing pain. Endorphins, as many of you will know, can also be released through exercise. So the endorphins can also be linked to the kind of feel-good highs of the drive brain. But research shows that this sort of mind, a mind that is at peace with itself, can think clearly and develop new insights. And that's because a kind of content, calm mind isn't dominated by any particular feeling, and so it's free to explore in an unfettered way. So this Safe Brain is key to people maintaining their physical and emotional well-being, and it's also crucial for organisations if they are to thrive, not just survive. So how can we interrupt this unhelpful looping that exists between the threat brain and the drive brain that's driven by the cultures in many organisations? How can we move from a tricky brain that sometimes works against itself to a trained brain that can interrupt negative thought patterns, find focus and concentration, and not get swept up in the strong and powerful emotions of the old brain? In other words, a brain where the old and the new brain work effectively together. So on this slide in front of you now, we're talking about emotional integrity, and what that means, it means understanding our emotions and motivations and integrating their functions effectively. Because if we allow one part of our capability to dominate, then we get into trouble. So having now sort of set the context of how the brain has evolved and how the brain drives our responses to different situations, I'm going to go on to look at what the current thinking is around this. So is it possible to retrain our brains? So advances in neuroscience, as Neil mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, have proved that the brain is capable of changing itself. So our brains change in response to experience, and you can see on the screen in front of you there's a quote there from Dr. Daniel Siegel's book Mindsight, which is an excellent book if you're interested in knowing more about this. But he explains that new mental skills can be acquired with intentional effort, with focused awareness and with concentration. And what's really interesting to me in terms of the research that I've done and the reading around this topic is that attention and focus seem to come up a lot as being a really important factor in retraining our brains. And we're going to go on to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Interestingly as well, Daniel Goleman suggests that a primary task of leadership is to direct attention. However, in order to do this, we've first of all got to be able to focus our own attention, either on ourselves or on others or on the wider world. So that ability to focus attention in the right place is crucial to being able to retrain our brains. So if we just revisit this picture again, so if it's possible to retrain our brain and develop new neural pathways, then it must be possible to train ourselves to access that area of the brain, that motivational centre that we're calling the safe brain, when our threat responses have been activated. And so in this next part of today's webinar, we're just going to have a look at some of the ways that it's possible to do that. So there are lots and lots of different approaches to accessing what we're calling the safe brain. And I'm going to just touch upon a few of them now and then just give you a little bit more detail about how some of these might work. Interestingly, one of the key areas is around self-awareness and what is described as getting in touch with your inner voice. So that getting in touch with your inner voice is about paying careful attention to the internal physiological signals that exist within your body. So some of you may have heard of that being referred to as somatic signals. So essentially these are kind of subtle clues within the body, and they're monitored by an area of the brain called the insula. So attention given to any part of the body amps up the insula's sensitivity to that part. So if you were, for example, to tune into your heartbeat, the insula activates then more neurons in the circuitry in that area. And what I think is fascinating is that how well people can sense their own heartbeats has become a standard way of measuring self-awareness. So essentially, if we pay more attention to the signals in our body, we'll become better at reading them and acting on them appropriately rather than just carrying on regardless. I'm sure you are all aware of people, or perhaps you're somebody yourself, who you get swept up in the emotion of the moment. And so that kind of amygdala-driven response to something, that fight, flight, or freeze, drives your behavior. And what we're saying here is that if you can start to tune into the signals that are in your body, maybe that's increased heart rate or breathing or a sort of sense of anxiety in your chest, if you can start to notice those and interpret them, it allows you to kind of slow down a response and not just react. So that self-awareness, that being in touch with yourself, is crucial. The next point there is around cognitive control, and that's all about placing your attention where you want it to be and keeping it there. So people who have good cognitive control tend to stay calm in a crisis. They're able to sort of tame their own agitation and recover quite quickly from defeat. And we're starting to see this looked at more and more in the field of education. So one social and emotional learning method that's being used now with school children to help them develop cognitive control is the traffic light approach. So when they're confronted with an upsetting problem, the children are asked to think of a traffic signal. So as you can probably imagine, the red light means stop, calm down, think before you act. The amber light means slow down and think of several possible solutions. The green light means try out a plan and see how it works. So thinking in these terms allows children to move away from that amygdala-driven response to more of a prefrontal-driven, deliberate behaviour. And whilst that's an example of what we're doing with children, it's also something that we start to do with people, with adults, when we're working with them, particularly for people who have that kind of amygdala-driven response. It's starting to help them find ways of slowing things down and just thinking through the options that they might have. And so that working on developing good cognitive control can really help people to start to access that safe brain state. I've already mentioned Daniel Siegel's book Mindsight, and he talks about what mindsight means. And he describes that as being as helping us to be aware of our mental processes without being swept away by them. So it enables us to get ourselves off the autopilot of ingrained behaviours and habitual responses, and moves beyond the reactive loops that we all have a tendency to get trapped in. So what he's talking about there is it lets us name, or he describes it as name and tame the emotions that we're experiencing rather than being overwhelmed by them. And I referred earlier to our webinar about emotional literacy, which goes into this topic in more depth. So if you're interested in understanding more about emotional literacy, then please do have a look at that webinar. However, briefly, this is our ability to communicate clearly what we're feeling without corrupting it, without exaggerating it, or without giving it a label. So as an example, I feel sad rather than I am sad. So I am sad is a kind of self-definition, and in a sense, it's very limiting. I feel sad suggests the ability to be able to recognize and acknowledge a feeling without being consumed by it. So we can identify the feeling, we can then accept it in the present moment as it is, and then we can let it go or transform it. So if you then think back to that threat drive loop that we described, if we're consumed by a feeling of fear or anger or sadness triggered by something that's happened at work, we might then get stuck in that loop where we then kind of react to it. But actually, if we can identify it and accept it, we can then let it go and move back towards that kind of calmer and more connected place of the safe brain that we've been describing. Mindfulness and reflection you'll see appearing there, and actually mindfulness sort of shows itself in all of these different approaches to accessing the safe brain. So I'm actually not going to talk about it in great detail now. I'm going to just touch upon it in a bit more detail in a moment. But essentially is the meditation of old, and it's a way of connecting with ourselves and directing our attention so that we notice what we're feeling and how we're experiencing something without judgment. And then finally, you'll see the final point in that list there is around building relationships. I've already described how, as we evolved so that we were motivated to stay connected. And so the impact of isolation can be really significant. And there's some fascinating research around what happens to people when they are isolated, both in terms of children and adults, and what impact that has on how the brain functions. But recognizing in moments of distress and threat that we are connected can help people to regain access to that sort of safe brain motivating part of their brain. And building relationships and trust also stimulates that parasympathetic nervous system that I mentioned. So the production of oxytocin, which helps to inhibit the fear center in the brain and also allows fearful feelings to subside more easily. So that relationship side of things is crucial to helping people access the safe brain. However, of all of these, the place to start, I think, and perhaps the most effective way of accessing safe brain is through being kind to ourselves. So Neil mentioned at the start of the webinar someone called Kristin Neff, and she's done a lot of work around self-compassion, and worth visiting her website, and there's a brief questionnaire that you can complete there around self-compassion. But essentially she looks at what are the 3 key components to self-compassion, and you can see them listed on the screen here. So kindness, tolerance and patience towards whatever emotions arise in us. So at the moment I'm talking about kindness to self, so recognizing the emotion and being patient towards it rather than getting frustrated with ourselves or telling ourselves that we're stupid or silly for feeling those things. The second part then, there's that word mindfulness again, so holding that experience in balance, so not denying it but also not exaggerating it either. And then common humanity. So I mentioned a moment ago that sense of being connected, and it is so important. So we're all in this together, and recognizing that suffering, if you like, is part of being human, and that some of what we do isn't our fault, but it might be our problem. So if we go back to that premise that problematic looping is kept in place through a desire to avoid feelings of threat. So going back to the workplace example, if we feel threatened by our boss, if we feel that we're about to get sacked, our response to that is to go into that drive brain place of I must work harder, I must achieve more. That loop is kept in place because we're trying to avoid that feeling of threat. But to interrupt that loop, we have to face those threats differently. So we have to resist the urge to return to that kind of familiar threat-based coping strategy. And so the way to do that is to support the development of our safe brain. So the part of ourselves that can help us to soothe and relax and repair and get ready for reflection and deep thought and change. And so the research into self-compassion shows that how we talk to ourselves and how we think about ourselves has a profound effect on which parts of our brain are activated or not. So self-compassion is all about developing your own ability to regulate the 3 effect centers that we've talked about, threat, drive and safety, more effectively, by encouraging that involvement of the soothing and restorative part of the brain, which then in turn activates the parasympathetic nervous system. And one way of regulating that threat system is to notice and respond to self-criticism with compassion, and to feelings that we may have of guilt or shame or whatever they may be, doing that from a place of compassion. So that sounds very simple and lovely, but actually developing the compassionate mind is not something that's that easy, and certainly doesn't happen overnight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the attributes and skills associated with the compassionate mind, and this has kind of been pulled out of the research done by Nilisha Wickramasinghe, who I've mentioned a couple of times. And one thing I think that stands out from all of the work around this is that people need to have the motivation to want to do this, and they need to feel committed to doing it, because it requires practice regularly, often, and it can't be something that people just sort of think, oh, I can tick that box and it's done. So one way of addressing the problems that are associated with this whole overstimulated threat and drive center is to develop the capacity of these soothing effects, as I've said. So first of all, it's probably important to just define what we mean by compassion. So what I'm talking about here is behavior that aims to nurture and look after and soothe and protect in order to help ourselves and others. So in other words, the work of compassion is to regulate, in particular, our threat brain reactions, but also to manage our drive brain responses. So self-compassion is a practice that enables us to face into the threats that we may perceive and then soothe ourselves in order to enable new thinking and emotions from our new brain capability to emerge. So just looking at some of the attributes that are listed there then, so care for well-being. We all have this as a natural instinct, and if we're thinking about it from a compassionate point of view, we have to remind ourselves that as humans we have a need to care for and be cared for. Sensitivity, we need to want to be compassionate, and this requires opening ourselves up to emotion and to other people. And if we don't do that, then it's quite difficult to sort of develop a compassionate approach. Sympathy, we have to be able to recognise and notice that we or someone else is in distress and be moved by it. If we go back to that premise that our emotions motivate us, with sympathy, if we are moved by somebody else's distress or our own distress, this gives us the motivation to then want to do something about it. Distress tolerance, so the ability to stay with emotions and accept them. So to give up the kind of fighting or struggling with them. And so that really involves us becoming more aware of what upsets us and being able to stand back and notice how we're reacting without judging ourselves or condemning ourselves. So that has to be done with a compassionate tone. And then empathy, so that begins with an open mind and curiosity and a genuine desire to really know and discover and understand. So we have to have that distress tolerance to be able to stay with our emotions, but it's about recognizing distress, being moved by it, accepting it and understanding it. So true empathy, if you like, is an active imagination, so what it's like to be another or to walk in someone else's shoes. Then non-judgment, so engaging with the complexities of emotion and behavior without condemning them, so recognizing that what we do for a lot of us is in our genes or conditioned by our environment and culture, and so we need understanding rather than judgment. And then some of the skills that you can see then around the outer circle. So just to pick a couple out there, attention or compassionate attention. So learning to pick out and focus on the good stuff. So noticing without judgments, but being instead warm and friendly. Reasoning and thinking. So asking ourselves, what's the function of this feeling or behavior? So we're starting from the basis that we're doing the best we can to survive in this difficult or complex environment that we're in. So what is the function of this feeling or behavior? And then behaving, it can be as simple as being kind to ourselves, but it could also include courage, so courage to change or confront something or adapt. But it's ultimately about choosing a behavior that's in the service of relieving distress or suffering. So there's a lot in there, and as I say, it isn't something that you can just kind of tick a box and great, I've done that now. Because a compassionate mind is a mind that's able to regulate and integrate the emotions and motives of the new brain and the old brain, just going back to that picture that we showed towards the beginning. And cultivating that compassionate mind has to start with self-compassion, and it also involves a real willingness and commitment to practice new ways of thinking and responding and behaving to ourselves first and then to others. So the first step towards compassion, as I've just described, is to become sensitive to our emotional experience and to develop a way of being with our emotions that's calm and centered. And that's really where the word mindfulness comes back in, because mindfulness practice is the foundation of cultivating this kind of compassionate mind and accessing those safe brain capabilities. So today isn't a webinar about mindfulness, so I'm not going to go into lots of detail about mindful techniques, but I do just want to touch upon some of the benefits of it and just talk a little bit about what we consider to be some good mindfulness techniques when thinking about accessing safe brain. So there's lots on the screen in front of you. I think some of the ones that stand out for me are around that increased ability to deal with stress. Given the very complex, fast-paced, stressful environments that people work in now, actually that ability to be able to deal with stress would be a huge benefit for many people, because not only does it help them from a kind of physical and emotional point of view, but it also then allows some of those other benefits around greater focus and concentration, improved judgment and decision making, being able to anticipate and serve other people's needs, greater ability to deal with conflict. All of these things are crucial to a business success. And one of the arguments we sometimes hear is, oh, this all sounds a bit fluffy, but actually this is crucial for people to be able to understand and manage and control their emotional responses to things, because there are some real tangible business benefits. So how do people become more mindful? Well, as I've already said, people have to be motivated to want to do it. They have to have some interest in helping themselves and others in that compassionate way, and then they have to practice. And some people will find that easier than others. So if someone is very self-critical, they might find mindfulness practice really difficult, because the whole kind of self-criticism tends to activate the threat brain. So they may need to kind of spend some time developing self-compassion first before they can kind of get into mindfulness in a significant way. But in terms of what mindful practice is, it can include a huge range of things, from writing, so keeping a journal or free-fall writing, meditation, breathing practice, walking, eating, exercise. There are lots of things available to help people with mindfulness in terms of books that are available, but also apps. I think one app that gets a lot of good feedback is Headspace, which allows people to kind of practice being mindful for short periods of time during the day. I just wanted to draw the attention though between two broad categories of mindfulness. The first is around using mindfulness practice to relax and soothe. So that for me is about the helping yourself to come back from a place of feeling threatened into a sort of safe brain center. So using calming, soothing, centering as a way of approaching mindfulness. And then the other category is around using mindfulness practice to focus and attend. So we talked earlier on about the importance of people being able to direct their focus, that kind of cognitive control side of things. So actually using mindfulness to be able to practice placing your focus on something and bring your attention back to it if it gets distracted. And then we've included in here as well that cultivation of compassion, because it is the feelings of compassion that will help to activate safe brain. And that's crucial, I think, in terms of people being able to live more mindfully. So as I've said, today hasn't been about going into lots of detail about mindfulness. So hopefully what we've done is given you a few pointers about how people can start to practice accessing their safe brain. So we've looked at this kind of complex corporate world that stimulates threat reactions and drive responses, and the fact that fear as a motivator does have a detrimental impact on people and businesses, and that's a real tangible impact that we see, not something that's just an imagined impact. The good news is that the brain can be retrained, but actually accessing what we've called safe brain takes real motivation, it takes curiosity, and crucially it takes practice. And we've talked about compassion, which is a way of being which involves kindness, acceptance and connection. And I think if you can hold those concepts and understand that being kind to yourself, accepting the emotions that you're experiencing without judgment, and then maintaining those connections, feeling that sense of being part of the humankind, if you like, is a really important way of maintaining compassion. And then I think really importantly, leaders need to know themselves and others in order to help them direct attention in the right way. And so that's why we find that a lot of this work we're doing with leaders to help them, first of all, start to understand themselves and how they respond in different situations, so that they can then start to be compassionate to themselves and others and support other people where they see them having those kind of threat brain responses and drive reactions. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So Neil, are there any questions that have come in as I've been talking?
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And yeah, just that there's lots of really interesting information there, and I'm sure everyone's been listening intently as they've gone through. And it has generated a couple of questions. One from a practical perspective, a few people asking, are we going to share the presentation? So just to let you know, we've been recording the whole presentation from start to finish. So when the webinar's finished, we'll be sending it out to you, so you will have a copy of the presentation that you've just seen. There's a few questions, Ruth, and I sort of, if I link them together, because they sort of around a similar theme. So the first theme that have come out from some of the questions is around the sort of, how does this stack up in a commercial environment where it's very much driven by shareholders and making a profit, and actually do organisations need to care about which type of drive people are coming from?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think, Neil, you probably agree with me. We come across this question a lot when we're working with businesses. There's a real sense of drive behaviours are good, therefore why would we do anything to remove drive behaviours? And actually, what we're saying is, yes, drive behaviours are good, but it's about where they're motivated from. So where they come from a place of threat, actually those drive behaviours aren't sustainable. Because they may deliver short-term results, but ultimately they will lead to burnout and stress and anxiety and illness. Whereas actually, if from a commercial point of view, you can create a culture which is not driven by fear and which allows people to operate from more of that kind of connected, calm, safe brain place, they will still access those drive behaviours, but they'll do so in a really positive way, which allows them to, free up their thinking, be more creative, be far more effective, and not get to a place of burnout because they're being supported by that safe brain state. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I think it's something we come across a lot, isn't it? Which sort of leads into this. So there's a few questions again on a similar theme, which is around, it's almost $1 million question really. So if we understand this at a theoretical level, and we get the logical reason for doing it, but how do we practically implement what we've been talking about? And how do you get people to genuinely engage with this as a topic and sponsor it from senior level?
Yeah, another good question. I mean, I think certainly at a senior level, sometimes there can be a sort of almost a threat brain response to the topic, because it's an area that not everybody feels comfortable with, and there needs to be that desire, that curiosity, that motivation to go there in the first place. But it's then about working with individuals and helping them to explore what are the ways in which they can start to access safe brain. So I mean that can be done one-to-one, it can be done in groups, but it's not a short-term fix.
No.
And what's good is that people can, if they're really interested in it, they can go away and do their own practice and their own reading around it with some of the resources that we've pointed to. And mindfulness is something that we've touched upon a few times, and certainly that would form a key part of working with any group, is sort of starting to help them understand the benefits of mindfulness, and that it isn't kind of sitting with crossed legs and humming. There's some real value to being able to stop and reflect and breathe and think. Yeah. And so yeah, I think it's not something that you can say, right, here's a list of things, do these, off you go. It is a longer term commitment to introducing those practices into the workplace. And I think where you've got that skepticism at the senior level, then really the work needs to start there, because that's where they will then start to recognise the benefits themselves, and that will then help to change the culture.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and as you say, it's something that we come across a lot at senior level, that it generates that threat response straight away, because they often don't want to go there. And I think that's where often, as you said, one-to-one, which we often find that sort of becomes a topic within one-to-one coaching at senior and exec level, where you can get them to a place where it's just between them and their coach, rather than having to discuss it at an open level. And then once you've got that culture at a senior level, it's then much easier to have it sponsored and rolled out as a way of being across the organisation.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think that's covered, because I'm conscious of the time. We're sort of 50 minutes in now, and that's covered the majority of the themes that were coming out of the questions that people had typed in. So thanks to those people who'd asked questions. So I think we'll leave it there for today. So thanks again, Ruth. That's been a really interesting and informative presentation. I'm sure it's given lots of people food for thought as to how they might engage with this topic within their own teams and organisations. And just to reiterate, we have recorded it. Those of you that have registered, we'll be sending this out to you. So thanks for taking part, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.
Thank you.